There is a war that won an empire and destroyed it. December 12, 1948, a rubber plantation near Batang Kali, Malaya. Dawn broke over the jungle. British soldiers from the Scots Guards rounded up 24 Chinese men, separated them from their families, led them outside, then shot them all dead. 24 unarmed male civilians were killed by the British Army's Scots Guards on December 12, 1948. The official story? The British claimed it as the biggest success since the emergency began. Parliamentary records describe the killings as justified. The truth: wholly innocent men were mercilessly murdered. But here's what Britain didn't want you to know. Batang Kali wasn't an isolated incident. It was a template. Between 1948 and 1960, Britain fought a secret war in the jungles of Malaya, a war so brutal, so innovative in its methods, that it became the blueprint for every counterinsurgency campaign that followed, from Vietnam to Iraq, from Afghanistan to Northern Ireland. By the beginning of 1962, counterinsurgency doctrine from Malaya informed the U.S. Army's training programs for more than 60 client states in the Caribbean, Latin America, the Middle East, Asia, and Africa. The British called it the Malayan Emergency. Not a war. War would void insurance policies. An emergency. They told the world it was a model campaign, hearts and minds, minimum force, the civilized way to fight insurgency. Christopher Hale described it as dispelling the myth of the British being exemplary in their defeat of the insurgency. When the Japanese left, August 1945, Japan surrendered. World War II ended, and across Asia, colonial subjects who'd fought Japanese occupation asked a simple question: why should we accept European masters again? Following World War II, the British returned to a much different Malaya than they had departed 3 years earlier. For 3.5 years, the Japanese had occupied Malaya. The ensuing occupation resulted in economic deterioration, dislocation, and racial disharmony. The Malayan People's Anti-Japanese Army, the MPAJA, had fought the Japanese with British help. Communist-led, mostly Chinese, they'd been promised political reform after victory. They'd expected partnership, liberation. Although the British were initially greeted with open arms upon their return in 1945, this feeling quickly diminished. Why? Because Britain wanted its colony back, exactly as before. Rubber plantations owned by British companies, tin mines controlled by British capital, political power in British hands. Malaya was part of the British Empire, but had been occupied by Japan during the Second World War. The MNLA had its origins in the Malayan People's Anti-Japanese Army, which had fought against Japanese occupation. The MPAJA transformed into the Malayan National Liberation Army, the MNLA. Communist, organized, armed with weapons the British had given them to fight Japan, and absolutely determined that Malaya would not remain a colony. The trigger. June 17, 1948, Sungwe Siput, a small town surrounded by rubber plantations. 3 European plantation managers were killed by 3 young Chinese men suspected to have been communists. 3 dead Europeans. That's all it took. The deaths were used by the British colonial occupation to either arrest or kill many of Malaya's communist and trade union leaders. Mass arrests swept the colony. Left-wing activists disappeared. Trade union leaders were detained. These mass arrests and killings saw many activists going into hiding and fleeing into the Malayan jungles. In June 1948, a state of emergency was declared in the British colony of Malaya. Emergency powers, detention without trial, curfews, movement restrictions. The British colonial government gave itself unlimited authority to crush dissent. Led by Chin Peng, the remaining Malayan communists retreated to rural areas and formed the Malayan National Liberation Army on February 1, 1949. Now, Britain faced an insurgency. But not the kind of enemy they'd fought before. The MNLA drew the majority of its support from Chinese communities living and working in remote rural areas. These weren't soldiers in uniforms. They were farmers, rubber tappers, tin miners, people who looked exactly like everyone else. How do you fight an enemy you can't see? Britain was about to invent an answer that would reshape modern warfare. Britain's My Lai. Let's return to that morning in Batang Kali. In the early evening of December 11, 1948, a patrol of Scots Guards numbering 14 soldiers entered the remote settlement. The plantation was home to about 50 adults and children, Chinese workers who tapped rubber for a Scottish owner. The British soldiers separated the men from the women and children and confined them overnight in a wooden long hut where they were interrogated. Think about that night. Families torn apart, men held at gunpoint, women and children listening to interrogations, wondering if they'd see their husbands and fathers alive again. The soldiers carried out mock executions to terrify the unarmed male villagers in the hope of obtaining information about rebels that might have been nearby. Mock executions, guns to heads, triggers pulled on empty chambers, psychological torture designed to break men. That night, the first victim was shot. The next morning, December 12th, the soldiers had a decision to make. The women, children, and one man were put on a truck. The troops then escorted 23 of the men out from the long hut where they had been held overnight, and within minutes, every one had been shot dead. 24 men, unarmed, executed. The British government's official parliamentary record in 1949 described the killings as justified. One survivor, a man named Chong Hong, who was in his 20s, he fainted and was presumed dead. Not content to stop there, their houses were burnt to the ground, leaving their relatives destitute. And the witnesses? Children. Lim Ah Yin, whose 11th birthday happened on the same day as the massacre. Her father was one of the civilians executed. The last time she saw her father was when a Scots Guard was pointing a rifle at him. A week later, both she and her heavily pregnant mother were made to clean up his corpse, which was bloated and covered in flies. This was December 1948. The emergency had been declared just 6 months earlier. Batang Kali set the tone for everything that followed. The problem: an invisible enemy. The big problem the British confronted was that it was very difficult to distinguish counterinsurgents from ordinary civilians. Imagine being a British soldier in Malaya. You patrol a village. Everyone smiles, everyone bows, everyone claims to know nothing. That night, insurgents attack your base. They had food, shelter, intelligence. Someone in that village helped them. But who? These communities were categorized as squatters by the colonial authorities. This term was an attempt to categorize these communities as landless and justify their displacement. Squatters. That's what the British called Chinese communities who'd lived on the jungle's edge for generations, growing vegetables, tapping rubber, earning a living. The MNLA peaked at about 8,000 in 1951. 8,000 insurgents, supported by an estimated 1 million sympathizers out of a Chinese population of 2 million. How do you defeat an insurgency when half the population might be helping them? Lieutenant General Sir Harold Briggs arrived in 1950 with a plan.
Britain launched a large-scale counterinsurgency campaign to combat the MNLA and isolate them from their supporters, which included the forced resettlement of around 500,000 people into guarded barbed wire settlements. 500,000 people. Think about that number. The primary emphasis was on breaking the guerrillas' links to their popular base. The logic was simple. Insurgents need food, shelter, and intelligence from the population. Remove the population, you remove insurgent support. They called them new villages. They were concentration camps. Tens of thousands of villagers were forcibly uprooted from their land at gunpoint. Troops burned their homes and crops. Families given hours to pack their lives into trucks, everything they owned, then driven to barbed wire compounds surrounded by watchtowers and armed guards. They were deported to barbed wire encampments euphemistically known as new villages. Inside the camps, curfews, identity checks, food rationing, food denial operations. Food became a weapon. If insurgents attacked, the entire village's rations were cut, collective punishment. Starve the population, starve the insurgents. The torture chambers. But relocation wasn't enough. Britain needed intelligence. Torture techniques were widely used. These included beating suspects on the stomach with a flat board, twisting the testicles, suffocation with a wet cloth, and burning with cigarettes. Interrogation centers appeared across Malaya. Men disappeared into them. Some came back broken. Some didn't come back at all. Imaginative exploitation of surrendered insurgents. Use of police jungle squads. Imaginative exploitation. That's the euphemism for torture. And when torture produced confessions, the guards then rounded up civilians and massacred them. This wasn't Batang Kali alone. A rare exception occurred in December 1948 when over 20 unarmed civilians were killed. Rare exception. That's how official histories describe systematic abuse.
Templar arrives. February 1952. General Sir Gerald Templar stepped off a plane in Kuala Lumpur, Britain's new man in Malaya, sent to fix the disaster. The answer lies not in pouring more soldiers into the jungle, but in the hearts and minds of the Malayan people. The shooting side of this business is only 25% of the trouble, and the other 75% lies in getting the people of this country behind us. Hearts and minds. It became the most famous phrase in counterinsurgency history. But what did it actually mean? Richard Stubbs argues that the hearts and minds approach was about gaining the enthusiastic support of the population rather than just their acquiescence. Sounds noble, doesn't it? Win the people over, provide services, build trust. Here's the reality. The Malayan case suggests that population-centric policies work best when they are also spatially aware, imposing security on specific areas. Imposing security. That means control, barbed wire, checkpoints, curfews. Peak support amongst the wider population was estimated at 1 million. The police and army peaked in 1952 at 60,000 and 40,000 respectively. These were supported by home guards recruited from the same rural Chinese. This peaked at around 250,000. 250,000 local guards, that's 5% of the entire population serving as auxiliary police. Not because they loved Britain, because many viewed it as a way to protect their communities, whilst others needed work. You guard your village or starve. That's not winning hearts and minds, that's coercion. The numbers don't lie. Within this period, every major indicator of conflict slumped. The number of rubber trees slashed by insurgents declined from 70,000 a month in January 1952 to less than 1,000 in September.
Why? Because the start of the Korean War on June 25, 1950, gave an enormous boost to the stagnant Malayan economy. The peninsula's primary commodities, rubber and tin, were exported in large quantities. Jobs, money, prosperity. The Chinese squatters who had been resettled were now provided with jobs. Wages were substantial, and prosperity spread within the communities. Hearts and minds, or economic opportunity? Average insurgent strength slumped from 7,292 in 1951 to 6,765 in 1952, while the ratio of insurgent to security force casualties climbed from 3 to 1 in 1951 to 6 to 1 in 1952. The insurgents weren't defeated by kindness. They were ground down by overwhelming force, population control, and economic incentives that made resistance too costly. But there's something else, something historians discovered decades later. When the British pulled out of Malaya in 1957, any incriminating evidence about events like Batang Kali had been destroyed. Files burned, records shredded, evidence eliminated. After the Scots Guards massacred the civilians, British diplomats introduced Regulation 27A, which authorized the use of lethal weapons to prevent escape from arrest in an attempt to retroactively legalize the massacre. Read that again. After murdering 24 civilians, Britain changed the law to make the murders legal retroactively. This new law was uncovered within secret documents which had been hidden from public view at Hounslow Park by the Foreign Office. Operation Legacy, the systematic destruction and concealment of evidence across the dying empire. Britain didn't just fight a dirty war in Malaya. Britain covered it up, destroyed the evidence, rewrote history, and then sold the world a myth. Hearts and minds, minimum force, the civilized way to fight insurgency.
Independence. August 31, 1957. Malaya gained independence. The emergency officially ended in 1960. Britain declared victory, the model counterinsurgency, proof that colonial powers could defeat communist insurgency through patience and restraint. More than 500 soldiers and 1,300 police had been killed during the conflict. Communist losses were estimated at over 6,000 killed and 1,200 captured. Although the emergency was declared over in 1960, Communist leader Chin Peng renewed the insurgency against the Malaysian government in 1968. This second phase lasted until the dissolution of the MCP in 1989. The insurgency continued for 3 more decades, but by then it was Malaysia's problem, not Britain's. Britain walked away claiming success, and the world believed them. The Americans take notes. Vietnam, 1962. American advisors pour into South Vietnam to fight communist insurgency. What's their playbook? Malaya. In December 1960, soon after the emergency ended, the SA Army's Handbook for the Suppression of Communist Guerrilla/Terrorist Operations looked to the Malayan example. The U.S. Army obtained the British Counterinsurgency Manual, Conduct of Anti-Terrorist Operations in Malaya, or ATOM. Soon, all of the Army's service schools received copies of ATOM to formulate their counterinsurgency doctrine. The Strategic Hamlet Program in Vietnam? Copied directly from Malaya's new villages. Forced population relocation, barbed wire compounds, food control. Several of the methods developed by British forces during the Malayan emergency would be later adopted by the U.S. military in its bloody war in Vietnam. Mass forced resettlement of populations, search and destroy missions, and hearts and minds policies.
troop insertion using helicopters, psychological warfare, the spraying of toxic herbicides from aircraft to destroy jungle crops, all tested in Malaya, all perfected for Vietnam. The My Lai massacre, March 16, 1968, American soldiers murdered over 500 Vietnamese civilians. It shocked the world. How could Americans commit such atrocities? But British author Christopher Hale described Batang Kali as Britain's My Lai. The difference? My Lai was exposed, investigated, prosecuted. Batang Kali was covered up. A 1948 investigation of those killings was later criticized as being a cover-up, and in 1993, the Foreign Office intervened to prevent another one from taking place. The pattern repeats. Northern Ireland, 1971. British troops deploy to suppress Republican insurgency. The same techniques appear. Although forced population movement was contemplated from time to time during the conflict, it was never attempted. Why not? Because Northern Ireland was part of the UK, British citizens, British media, British scrutiny. You can't build concentration camps in Belfast the way you can in the Malayan jungle. But other methods? Many of the techniques used in Malaya were employed in Northern Ireland. Interrogation centers, detention without trial, the 5 techniques, hooding, white noise, stress positions, sleep deprivation, food deprivation. Iraq, 2003. British forces deployed to Basra. Within months, allegations of abuse surface, torture, beatings. A hotel receptionist named Baha Musa dies in British custody. Army training manuals failed to explain that the 5 techniques had been banned by the British since 1972 and were also illegal under the Geneva Convention. Banned in 1972. Used in Iraq in 2003. Why? Because the Malayan playbook never went away. It just went underground.
75 years of silence. In 1970, several soldiers involved in Batang Kali told British media of their guilt over shooting innocent civilians. Finally, confessions, soldiers admitting they'd murdered unarmed civilians, that the official story, shot while trying to escape, was a lie. Just weeks after the soldiers confessed, the Conservative government was elected and the Batang Kali inquiry was stopped with a view to uphold the good name of the Army. Uphold the good name of the Army. 24 murdered civilians mattered less than Britain's reputation. Survivors and relatives started a legal battle in 2012 against the British government over the killings. Lim Ah-yin traveled to London for the Supreme Court hearing. She was 78 years old. Her journey had begun in December 1948, when she was 11. In November 2015, the United Kingdom Supreme Court ruled that the British government was not obliged to hold a public inquiry into the killing because the atrocity was committed too long ago. Too long ago. British courts ruled that although the Scots Guards had massacred innocent civilians and that this was possibly a war crime, nobody could be held legally responsible. But something changed. In 2025, 77 years after the massacre, the UK government apologized for the 1948 massacre of 24 unarmed men at Batang Kali, Malaya. An apology, finally, after everyone involved was dead. The UK deeply regrets the tragic deaths and the pain suffered by many families. Regret, not responsibility, not justice, just regret. The war that never ended. The Malayan emergency officially ended in 1960, but its legacy continues today. Every counterinsurgency manual,
every Hearts and Minds campaign, every forced relocation program, every interrogation technique that skirts the line between legal and torture. They all trace back to Malaya, the laboratory, the testing ground. By the beginning of 1962, that counterinsurgency doctrine informed the U.S. Army's training programs for more than 60 client states. 60 nations learning to fight insurgency the British way. Vietnam, Algeria, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria. The methods Britain perfected in Malaya's jungles spread across the world, and the myth spread with them. This is civilized counterinsurgency. This is how democracies fight dirty wars.
What Britain really won. The Malayan emergency was called a success. Britain defeated the communist insurgency, maintained stability, granted independence to a pro-Western government. Victory. Except it wasn't. The Malayan emergency was a key moment in the decolonization of the British Empire and the political future of the region. Because here's what really happened. Britain spent 12 years, deployed hundreds of thousands of troops, forcibly relocated 500,000 civilians, built concentration camps, tortured suspects, massacred villagers, to hold on to a colony it was going to lose anyway. Malayan independence, through the 1957 creation of the Federation of Malaya, further undermined the insurgency as it lost its grounds as a war of liberation. Independence was inevitable. The question was never if, only when. Britain could have negotiated independence in 1948. Instead, it fought for 12 years. 12 years of brutality. 12 years of war crimes covered up. 12 years perfecting methods that would haunt the world for decades. The true cost. Thousands died. Some 11,000 people died in the emergency. That's just the official count. How many deaths went unrecorded? How many civilians killed and buried without documentation? We'll never know. When the British pulled out of Malaya in 1957, any incriminating evidence had been destroyed. The files were burned, the records shredded, the truth erased. But the moral cost? That can't be destroyed. Every counterinsurgency campaign since Malaya has used Britain's playbook: Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, and every one has failed the same way, by alienating the population they claimed to protect. Why this destroyed the empire? The Malayan emergency didn't destroy the British Empire through military defeat. Britain won that war. It destroyed the empire through moral bankruptcy. Because the methods Britain used, concentration camps, torture, collective punishment, systematic cover-ups, revealed what empire really meant. Not civilization, not progress, not the rule of law. Control at any cost. When the world saw what Britain did to hold Malaya, they saw what empire really was, and they rejected it. Kenya's Mau Mau uprising followed similar patterns. Similar abuses occurred during national liberation struggles in Malaya, Aden, Cyprus, and Northern Ireland. Each time, Britain claimed necessity, security, the fight against terrorism. Each time, Britain used the same methods, and each time, the empire shrank. By 1968, the empire was gone. Not because Britain lost wars, because Britain couldn't justify the methods needed to win them anymore. The silence continues. The Batang Kali massacre remains an obscure historical event in the eyes of the Malaysian public, and none of those responsible for the killings has ever been properly brought to justice. Most Britons have never heard of Batang Kali, or the Malayan emergency, or the hundreds of thousands of people forcibly relocated. The school curricula don't teach it. The memorials don't commemorate it. Britain remembers the empire it wants to remember: civilized, benevolent,
a force for good, not the empire that built concentration camps in Malayan jungles. Final thought. The Malayan emergency was called a secret war. It was secret because Britain hid it, destroyed the evidence, rewrote the history. But secrets don't stay buried forever. The files at Hounslow Park surfaced, the survivors spoke, the truth emerged. This was the war that won Malaya and lost an empire. Because in fighting to hold on to colonies, Britain revealed that empire couldn't exist without brutality. And once the world saw that brutality clearly, empire was finished. The sun didn't set on the British Empire because of military defeat. It set because the light finally exposed what empire really was, and the world looked away in disgust.